I am a writer, and I started writing when I was 16, and by the time I was 18, like many other young girls my age, I was obsessed with the story of Bella Swan and her eternally youthful vampire boyfriend, Edward Cullen. So inspired, I switched on my mom's old computer and I began to write. Now, when I was done, I read the story back to myself, but it made me uncomfortable. I had written a story about a blonde girl with blue eyes and rosy cheeks who lived in California, a place I'd never been. Yeah. And much like Bella Swan, was experiencing a supernatural love all of her own. So I was deeply ashamed, because until that moment, it had never occurred to me that I could have written a story about an African girl in an African country experiencing a fantasy story of her own whilst having a glorious afro. That just never crossed my mind before, and I wondered why. So that day, I decided to scrap that story about the blonde girl with the blue eyes and swapped it instead for a familiar story of a girl with brown eyes and kinky hair and skin as dark as mine. So I want to take you guys on a journey of Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism is a term that was coined by Mark Derry in 1994 in his essay, Black to the Future. Now, Afrofuturism is a term that is used to describe work that explores exclusively Black themes through science fiction, through fantasy, through horror, and techniculture. Afrofuturism often asks the question, what does Blackness look like in the future? Now, we can't talk about Afrofuturism without mentioning Sanra. Now, Sanra is a pioneer of Afrofuturism and was often considered the godfather of Afrofuturism. Sanra was a jazz musician, a poet, and a philosopher, and he considered himself part of the angel race from another planet, sent to Earth to spread the message of peace and love. Now, we can't also talk about Afrofuturism without talking about Octavia E. Butler. Now, Octavia is a Hugo and Nebula Award-winning sci-fi writer. Now, she's my personal favorite because she wrote a story called Fledgling, a story of a 53-year-old vampire in a 10-year-old's body. Now, what made this vampire extra special was she could walk in the daylight whereas other vampires couldn't, and it was because of her melanin. So what? Yeah. Simple ideas, simple stuff like that. So what's the big idea? What's my story really about here? What am I trying to say? Well, how about we introduce science fiction to children from a very young age? Introducing science fiction, not as Eurocentric or European concepts foreign to the African narrative, but as the norm, as the mainstream. Because I always ask myself, if I'd come across an Afrofuturist novel when I was younger, when I decided to write my story, maybe I'd have taken a specific Afrofuturist approach to it. Now, children will be reading Afrofuturist texts alongside books like Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, or books like The River Between by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I also want people to create a platform for Afrofuturist writers, right? We could create a world, a virtual world, a literal world, where Afrofuturists can meet and exchange Afrofuturist ideas. So the more exposure that Afrofuturists get, the more Afrofuturists we will have. Now, someone will be like, Masi, this is all fine and well, Afrofuturism sounds cool, but don't we already have that in African mythology and folklore? Isn't that kind of Afrofuturism? Isn't that kind of just like science fiction-y, really, maybe? And I'll be like, yeah, sure, because the blueprints are there. African mythology and folklore have always had strong links to spirituality and the unknown. Africans have always had a weird relationship with strange things. We have stories of animals that spoke, West African tales of those of Anansi the spider, stories from Botswana, like Linzwela Baratani, translated as Lover's Hill, or my personal favorite story of Dudu and the Evil Giant. Now, when I talk about Afrofuturism in Africa, I always want people to think about this. What does Africanness look like in the future? Take a moment to think about what Africanness looks like in the future. What do you look like in the future? Now, write about that. Now, Afrofuturism doesn't only exist in literature. It exists in art as well. This is a piece by Kenyan-American artist Wangechi Mutu, who's based in Brooklyn. We can also find Afrofuturism in music. This is one of my personal favorites as well. SA musician, South African musician, Spook Matambo, who infuses Afrofuturist sounds in his music. We also find Afrofuturism in film, like 2014's film Afronauts, about Zambia's first attempt to send the first African to the moon in the 1960s. We also find Afrofuturism more commonly and more obviously in contemporary fashion today. Now, at the end of the day, my dream is to walk into a bookstore and have Afrofuturist novels written by beautiful African writers on the shelves. I want to not be able to get away from it. I want it to overwhelm me. I want Afrofuturism to take over the world and become a movement. Because I feel like there are no limits to what a writer can do. Because I believe firmly that there is no one way of being an authentic African writer. Thank you.